time, so go ahead and do the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. I'll call the meeting to order.
Mayor Smith,
Present. If you need
Alder
a...
Billiard, present. Alder Hill,
Present.
Alder Keen,
Present.
Alder Lancaster, present. Alder Matheson, present. Alder Wills. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything on the agenda, Wes, as far as alterations?
No changes.
All right, I'm gonna wait this time, David.
Make a motion that we approve the agenda.
I'll second that. Second you.
I was gonna go
I have
right.
a first, I have a second. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, the agenda's been approved.
It's gonna be fire, okay.
All right. Who wants to open us up?
I'll start. So, hello, board and mayor. Thank you for having me again tonight. As a reminder, I'm Lindsay Polish. We serve the city as Economic Development Council, and we are here tonight to discuss and dive deeply into the economic development tools that we can utilize for different projects in the city. So you all have a handout with a bunch of slides with tiny print on them. Does anybody need one? I have one extra. Okay. And so this is going to be a lot of information. Like I said, there's tiny print on your pages. There's a lot of information, a lot of statutory references. I don't need you to intake it all and understand it all tonight. That's not my goal. This goal tonight is to get you an idea of what these tools use. I am a big learning by doing person, so I find that this is a little bit abstract until we have a project in front of us. So don't feel bad if you don't understand or if you have questions. That's what I'm here for. And of course, after tonight, I'm not leaving. We can still discuss this and have questions and concerns and things like that later. So we will start, Wes, I think we'll go forward just a few slides. I think that's from last time, yeah.
And by the way, she may not be, but I'm gonna quiz y'all with these. There will be breaks.
And then we can go.
One more. Mark it now.
Get out the red pen.
Okay, so I wanted to start tonight, because we haven't done an economic development proposal here before, I wanted to start with the very basic process that we go through. So the first thing that happens usually is that a developer comes to us and says, hey, I have a project, but I can't make it work. I need a little bit more money. What can you do to help me with this project? So I have an example project. We have a grocery store and pad site development. They have a $25 million total construction cost, and they need $5 million. That is generally the type of project we're gonna get. We do have, there are some huge projects we've had, so there are some that are much larger than that, but generally, you're gonna get a development with some pad sites around it, and I need 20% of the construction cost. So the very first step we take is first, we have a conversation, usually with Wes, myself, and the developer, is this something we're even interested in? Is this even what we want? And if it is, we ask the developer to sign a preliminary funding agreement. That is the first thing that we do because it covers my costs and it covers financial advisors' costs. The city should not be taking its own money to investigate this economic development proposal. Somebody's asking us for money, we want to make sure that our costs are covered so that we can fully evaluate it and know where we are on this project. The other thing to keep in mind is that some projects we could get done in 2, 3, 4 months. Some of them might take a year, and we don't want to be all the way down the line and then the developer just pulls out and we've spent all this money and we don't have any project now. So the very first thing we do is a preliminary funding agreement. Typically the way that works is that the developer will give the city $20,000 to set aside in an account, and then the preliminary funding agreement has an evergreen clause, which means as I incur costs for the city, as financial advisors incur costs for the city will pay my bill and then tell the developer, okay, you owe us, we will take that money out of the preliminary funding agreement. And then they have to continually replenish that preliminary funding agreement, so there's always $20,000 in there. And that is just a very basic way to make sure that we're not spending city money and to make sure that the developer still has some skin in the game. We don't want to have a project where they're just getting free services from the city. So that is the very first thing we do. The second thing is typically we will have a meeting with the city's financial advisors. I think I mentioned last time, I work frequently with Baker Tilly, but we work with all different financial advisors. And we will just decide what kind of due diligence do we want to do. And this very broadly ranges. We can do due diligence where we just look into the developer themselves and say, have you been bankrupt? Have you been sued? Are there issues with any of your developments currently that you have been building? And that's a really good way, honestly, to just make sure that they're an honest developer. I have had people lie in those scenarios for due diligence, and that is really a big red flag that we are not interested in working with those people. If they're lying to us about something that we can find out on CaseNet, that's gonna be a problem. So that is some basic due diligence. We also usually have due diligence where I said $25 million in construction costs. I don't know if any of you know if that would be a typical, reasonable amount of money for a construction project, but when we use, Baker Tilly does this really well specifically, but they will go through and tell us, yes, that's average for per square foot for this type of development, that is what it costs. That allows us to tell the public, yes, we have vetted this project. They're not trying to get a ton of extra money out of us. This is what it actually costs. So those are the two big things that we'll do with due diligence. It can get into deeper. We can provide an actual financial impact analysis that shows each taxing jurisdiction just what they would receive or not receive from a project. So there's different ways to go about that, different things, but that is what we do to understand, is this something we want to negotiate on? Then, based on that due diligence will tell us what kind of incentive amount we should offer. When we're talking about incentives, we don't require the developer to go out and spend all of their money. You know, if you saw the news, there was a project up in the Kansas City area, a data center that was going on this week. A lot of the arguments against it were saying, this is a $1 million, billion-dollar company, why don't they have the money to do this? It's not that we require them to spend all of their money. It's, will they get a reasonable rate of return? Will they get the same rate of return that another project like this would get? You know, there's some cities, like we've talked about here, is that we have some sewer issues. So those costs to get that sewer done for that development may make their project have a horrible rate of return just because of those extra costs. So the idea is that we're able to lower that rate of return to what is reasonable. So that is one question that comes up a lot, is the developer has a lot of money, why do we need to give them? It's not that we require them to give all of their money for this project. It's that they need to get a reasonable rate of return, and that is what we're trying to get to with the incentives. That's where I say up there's a funding gap of $5 million. That means if they can get $5 million from the city in incentives, their rate of return will be reasonable to other projects like this. And that is really where a financial advisor who just has a lot of nationwide information is really helpful to us. I know for sometimes there are projects, like for example, the aquarium in Branson was a very specific project. There's not that many aquariums around to know what it costs. So we were able to go and get, not me, I was not working on that project, but we were able to go and get a third-party consultant to tell us, yes, these are reasonable costs for an aquarium. So that's kind of what we're looking at with due diligence. It's just really important. That's the step where if I always prepare my incentives thinking of what am I going to say in the public meeting? What is the public going to hear about this proposal? And that's where I want that information from due diligence. Yes, we checked that these are reasonable costs. Yes, we looked into the developer's background. That's the kind of stuff that we want to know and be able to stand behind a project when it comes out to the public. So based on that due diligence, like I said, we will get numbers from that due diligence as to how much they actually need. And that is when we start to negotiate the actual terms of the incentive and what kind of incentive we want to look at. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But that term, that what we get out of that negotiation is what we call a term sheet. So it is usually a page or two and is the very basic terms of the incentive. For this kind of project, we would say we are going to do a SID and pay Chapter 100 and their reimbursement is X amount of dollars. It is just the very basic terms of the incentive, and that is the hard part of the negotiation. So we do that up front before we get into, we'll talk about all the different statutory public hearings and all of that stuff. We want to get to the very basic central terms of the incentive before we get too far down here, because that term sheet might not come together, right? We might not get to an agreement on a developer as to how much they want and how much we're willing to give. We don't want to go through this whole process to not end up with an incentive. So the idea with the term sheet is that we do the hard work first, and then we can get all of the statutory notices out, we can negotiate the rest of the terms of the development agreement, knowing that we have those central terms stuck in line. The term sheet is sort of a pre-contract. It is a contract, we sign it, the developer signs it, and then we are honored by that during the negotiation. But it is not something that would be open to the public. Generally, that would be a closed session item that we would talk to the board about, and that would be your first real decision to make on the particular incentive.
And while you're getting a drink, I will remind you guys, this is not a fund mechanism for everybody who comes to develop. You're choosing your project because of the but-for test. But for getting this project here, we will have all these other things. And that's what you guys all discussed at the last.
Yeah. So once we have those basic terms together and the incentive of the term sheet, that's when we start working on the development agreement and we get into all of the statutory notices and public hearings and things like that. We will have a development agreement with every incentive. That is really the central terms of, we are in a relationship together now, the city and the developer, and we're gonna make sure that you maintain your property as you're required to by city code, or else we'll shut the incentives off. We are going to require you to notify the city if you want to transfer any of your property, or else we'll shut the incentives off. There are a lot of different things, and I'll talk throughout the process. We won't get too far into the development agreement tonight, but I'll talk throughout about a few different things that we include in there. And the development agreement also can include specifics for this project. They vary, but you could have something specific where we want the developer to do X, Y, and Z that they wouldn't normally be required to do. All of that goes into the development agreement. And then finally, the last step is actually coming to the board for your approval. We will probably have talked about this project once or twice in closed session, but we will have open session on the project probably once, maybe twice. It really depends whether you want to have first reading or second reading at the same night. It just depends on what your schedule is like. Sometimes it depends on the project, if we want to make sure there's enough notice and those sorts of things. But that is the very basic run through of the application process. The timeline varies greatly depending on the project, depending on type of incentive we're using. It also depends a lot on the developer. I say in here that the due diligence usually takes 4 weeks. That's one Baker Tilly's timeline. That's usually who I work with, so that's where I'm referencing due diligence is usually Baker Tilly, but that doesn't mean that it has to be them. And then we request information from the developer, so they have to get us that information. Sometimes it takes a while to get that information. Sometimes they don't have it already yet when they come and ask the city about a proposal in the first place, and so they don't even know what they need to get together yet, and that's okay. I always tell developers I can work as fast as the statutes let me, because we do sometimes get, it took you 6 months to get us your information, and now you want to go. Sure, I understand, but there are, we still have to make sure that we hit all of the statutory requirements and things like that. Okay. Any questions on that process, or else we'll get straight into TIF? Okay. So tax increment financing. I don't know if anybody's particularly familiar with TIF. It gets a bad rap. I hope after this presentation you'll see that it's not a bad incentive. There are, in history, bad decisions, thank you, that have been made in relation to TIFs that have given them a bad rap, but they're really not bad just by themselves. So tax increment financing is found in the Missouri Revised Statutes. The way that TIF is written, it sort of appears like the city should pick redevelopment areas where we want to have developers come in, and then we issue an RFP for developers to come in. That's not actually how it works in function. That would be called sort of I'm sorry, I can't think of the word, but when a speculative TIF, where we want this type of development, we don't have a developer yet, but we want to see somebody come up with a project. That's one way to go about TIF. Most typically, we have a developer who comes to us and says, I would like to use a TIF. What can we do here? Like I said, they can be contentious. We will talk about it in just a minute, but they redirect taxes. So TIF is not a new tax, but it redirects some sales taxes and some property taxes to the developer as a reimbursed cost. So very basically, what happens with TIF is that we have an area that has a base amount of tax revenue that is generated by the development. Usually there's not much there. It might be an old shopping center, it might be vacant land, but we have some base revenue. Then the TIF is activated and a development is created. And then the tax revenue from that development increases. That's exactly what we want to happen. That increased amount of taxes, that is what gets redirected to taxing jurisdictions. So the very basic setting of it is that we don't have a lot of tax revenue in an area. A developer comes in and builds. Because they built there, we reimburse some of the revenue that comes off of that new development to the developer for their project costs. Does that make sense? It's not a new tax. That kind of gets confused sometimes. So there are 3 different types of taxes, of types of TIFs available. Really what we most commonly use is a blighted area. TIF is a blight tool. It is authorized by the Missouri Constitution through blight removal. So the statutes do allow for 2 different types of TIF, also conservation areas and economic development areas. So you might see TIFs in places where you're like, I didn't think that area was blighted. Like I didn't know that area was blighted. They might have a different type of TIF. However, most commonly we do use the blight TIF. You'll see as we talk through this just how intense TIF is. It is usually a more expensive and more detailed incentive. So most of the time developers don't want to risk, a lawsuit at the end of it or something like that. So most commonly we will use it as a blight tool. Let me go to the next slide. Thank you. So I said that the TIF revenues can reimburse a developer for their project costs. The TIF Act tells us what exactly we can reimburse a developer for. It is most commonly land acquisition, infrastructure improvements, and then renovation and construction of buildings. They may also include acquisition of machinery or equipment if it's personal property that's associated. Like for example, if you had a grocery store and then needed to buy all of the refrigerators and freezers, that would be included too. TIF does require the but-for test. So this is where when we do due diligence, if we're talking about a TIF, we will always request a but-for determination report. What but-for means is but for the use of TIF, the project would not happen. And that means the developer has a funding gap. The developer is saying, I cannot do this project unless I get this TIF. That's what we want to see from TIF. Sometimes that's associated with, oh, he said he won't do it without the TIF. That means we shouldn't even do this project. That's not really what we're looking for. We're looking, will the project succeed if TIF is used? If it's not used, if the TIF will not succeed without TIF, that's what we're looking for. And that is a mathematical analysis of project costs, what revenues will come up. That's where we're looking at that internal rate of return. So that is all done by your financial advisor. Whether a project meets the but-for test will be done by your financial advisor. And of course, it's a recommendation that you guys will then find. But that is a requirement for TIF. We'll talk about it with the other incentives. You could choose to require a but-for test for every incentive you use. That is something that we'll talk about with your economic development policy. That's a choice you can do.
But when you're examining the but-for clause, you're relying, when you're looking at the developer's ROI, you're relying upon documentation and information that the developer's providing.
We are, but like I said, most financial advisors will be able to look at what are standard construction costs and things like that. And so that helps us understand, is this a reliable project? For example, in a lot of the but-for determinations that I review that Baker Tilly provides, they will say, the developer has proposed X project, they're going to spend $214 on per square foot to build this facility. And then they'll say, that is standard, basically for most projects, it's between 200 and 220. That lets us know, yes, this is a project that actually makes sense.
And then is there a market norm for ROI? Because that can be subjective. David
Yes.
might wanna make on his project, 10% return.
Yes,
I might wanna make 15, I might, because I'm a little more greedy.
right.
And he presents his
That's exactly
information,
right, yeah.
I present mine, and so I assume there's a market norm that says no, 10% is the norm, not 15.
Yes, there's usually a range is how it usually shows up, and so we might have a incentive where the proposal that the developer says, I need 5 million, that might put them up at the high range of that rate of return. So we say, you're only getting 3 million, and that puts you much more down here, much towards the normal range. So there are all sorts of things that we can look at there. In my experience, Baker Tilly can get very detailed as we need them to be. So those are all things that we look at. That's a good question.
As well as expectations of that business. You'll get,
Yes, they will tell us, we expect to sell X, Y, and Z amount, and then we will check that and say, is that more than we actually think? And there are sometimes, it's kind of a little bit too complicated really to get into for our purposes tonight, but there are times where we think a developer may be saying that their project costs are a little bit higher than they typically are, but that doesn't benefit them. So it doesn't really matter to us because they, like for example, we'll talk about Chapter 100. That is a process in which they basically receive tax abatement. So under that but-for test, your financial advisor may say, well, their project costs are actually more than we typically think they should be for comparable projects, but they're just receiving tax abatement. So we're not, and I'll get into reimbursement versus tax abatement, but they're not, whether their project costs more or not, does not affect how much incentive they receive for some types of projects. So there's a lot of different considerations dependent on type of industry and also type of incentive we're looking at. Okay, so next we will jump into the ways that TIF finances. So I said that TIF revenues go back to reimburse the developer. There's two different things we're looking at here, and we'll talk about these more in detail in a few slides. But first, we have payments in lieu of taxes, and those are when we have a development, we have that base property tax that is being generated currently by a project. And then the project is built and it has an increased property tax value. That increase in property tax value is the pilot. Economic activity taxes are basically sales taxes. We'll get into exactly which taxes apply to economic activity taxes, but that is very basically sales taxes. Most TIFs that we use actually don't have much economic activity prior to using the TIF, so that base is very small, if any. But then there will be an increase in economic activity taxes because of the development that is built. And so those two buckets of money is what will eventually go to the developer. And we'll talk more in detail. Both of those, pilots and economic activity taxes, go into a special allocation fund within the city. So we will have separately set up special allocation funds for each project so that we know exactly what is generated by a project, what's been reimbursed to a project. There's very detailed accounting that is done there that also the financial advisor usually can assist on making sure that's all done correctly too. So then we go to the next slide. So I've been mentioning reimbursement. There are different ways to utilize TIF. Most common these days is what we refer to as pay-as-you-go. That means the developer pays all of their costs up front, they build the building, and then only if it generates new revenues does anything go back to the developer. This is the least risky option for the city, and this is most commonly what we do these days on TIFs. If the developer never builds the development they say they're going to, we would be embarrassed and probably disappointed, but we don't have to give them any money. They did not build what they said they were going to. They didn't generate any new revenue. There's nothing to reimburse them for. There are two other options for TIFs. The first is a TIF revenue bond, where bonds are issued, but they're only backed by the TIF revenues. And that is less risky for the city because the general revenues of the city are not bound to those bonds to pay off those bonds. Only the TIF revenue is set to pay off those bonds. That puts the onus on the developer to actually build the facility and to generate new revenue, but also puts it on them if the bonds default, it is their fault. The city might have some credit dings for having authorized that project, and again, it would be embarrassing, but that is not a general obligation of the city. With the city credit enhancement, that is where the city would be responsible for the debt service on the bonds. We really don't do that anymore. That is kind of where TIF got its dirty association. In the early 2000s, I mean, I'm talking about TIF like it's been here forever. It was built in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s is when a lot of these incentives came out. So when they first came out, a lot of cities were doing these revenue bonds, and basically that means that, the general obligation bonds, and that means that the developer builds a project using bond proceeds, and then he has to continue paying those back. If he takes those bond proceeds and runs, the city would be on the hook for paying that debt service back. And that's why we don't do that anymore. I'm not saying we would never do a general obligation TIF. We would do heavy due diligence. It would be a very important project for the city. It would be a very serious project. Most commonly, we do the reimbursement pay-as-you-go because that is the least risky for the city. We want this development, right? We are interested in this development, but it's not ours. It's not our responsibility. And that's usually where we stick, is with the reimbursement. The TIF revenue bonds, again, we would have a few terms and a few things for the developer to utilize, but generally if a developer comes and wants general obligation bonds, red flags, big red flags. And that is something too that you all can decide in your incentives policy what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. Most cities don't even look at general obligation bonds for TIFs, so. And then we can go to the next slide. And this one has a bunch of push-throughs, yes, thank you. So this is payments in lieu of taxes. So can I get up just a little closer? So as you can see, in the gray boxes, we have our base value. Our base property assessed value is $1,000. Our tax levy is $5. So that means the total tax revenue on this property without any TIF active is $50. If we had a TIF on that property, that revenue would continue going to all of the taxing jurisdictions that are affected. And when I say taxing jurisdictions, we're talking county, we're talking, fire protection, all of those. We're not talking state money, but we're talking all city, county, and then all of their special districts. So they would continue receiving that tax revenue. In the blue boxes, we have what would happen with TIF. Our total assessed valuation went up from $1,000 to $100,000. Great, that is exactly what we want to happen. Our tax levy stayed the same, so we have new revenue. We already had $50 of tax revenue that was already going to be generated by this project. So our total increment is $4,950. That $4,950 is the pilot, is the payment in lieu of tax. That will still be paid by the developer, but instead of it being paid to taxing jurisdictions, it will go into the special allocation fund, and that will reimburse the developer. Does that track for everybody, if that makes sense. And we're only talking about real property. We're not talking about personal property taxes. Those continue to flow to taxing jurisdictions all the time. And that is something too that we consider when we do due diligence and when we work on a project. We don't always include the personal property values that the taxing jurisdictions will continue to receive, but if it's a particular project where we really need to show the taxing jurisdictions, you will benefit from this too, we will calculate those numbers as to what personal property they expect to put in their facilities. So there are a few different things here, but very basically, the increased revenue from your property taxes goes to the special allocation fund to reimburse the developer. And if we had bonds, it would go to pay the debt service on those bonds. Same process, it goes to pay those costs of development. Any questions on pilots? That payment in lieu of tax, just for your awareness, in the context of TIF, this is a specific term. You might see that pilot or payment in lieu of taxes in other contexts for other sorts of city issues, but here in TIF, this is a set specific term. Then we go to the next slide. The other part of this is economic activity taxes. So economic activity taxes are very generally all sales taxes. Like I said, the TIF Act tells us what to do in all circumstances with TIF. It tells us what sales taxes are included and what sales taxes are excluded. We don't get to choose. So sometimes there's that discussion of, well, we don't want to have this tax taken away. We don't get to choose. It is the TIF Act tells us what can be collected by TIF and what cannot be collected by TIF. All of your sales taxes would be collected by TIF. You have a 1% general revenue, which is collected by TIF. And then you have a capital improvements tax and a public safety sales tax. Generally, you can only use those two specific funds for those specific purposes. But when TIF is active, it's kind of a washing machine and lets you take off that capital improvements requirement, takes off that public safety requirement, and then those funds, 50% of that increase goes to the developer. The other 50% continues to flow to taxing jurisdictions. So for both types of revenue, pilots and EATs, taxing jurisdictions still receive some funds. It sometimes feels like you're taking away all of our revenue. No, you do still get some. It's not a zero-sum game. You do get some. And here, again, just like with TIFs, just with pilots, we have that base revenue that continues to flow to taxing jurisdictions, and then we have an increased amount of revenue, and that gets split 50-50 between the special allocation fund to go reimburse the developer or pay debt service on bonds if we have those, and the other 50% continues to flow to taxing jurisdictions. Any questions there? The most common tax that is not collected by TIF is a hotel tax. There are a few others in the statutes. There's like a Jackson County special one. There's a transportation special tax that's excluded. It's one of those things, if you haven't talked to your legislator, and maybe you can get in there, but that's just, TIF tells us what we collect, what we don't collect, and there's really no gray area there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so TIF timelines. There's a lot of statutory requirements as far as when can we do projects and how long is TIF activated. So first, when you have a redevelopment project, TIF is activated on that project for 23 years. So we collect all of those sales taxes, those property taxes, we collect them for 23 years. When does that 23 years start? It starts with when we activate the TIF. So there's a few different things we will do when it comes to TIF. First, we would approve a TIF plan. The TIF plan will lay out all sorts of information. I don't get too far into it right now because we don't need to really get into the weeds of it right now. But the TIF Act tells us what has to be included in the TIF plan. It's development costs. It is statements from your bank saying, yes, we will finance this project. There's all sorts of things that are required in there. But when we approve that TIF plan, inside of it, there can be multiple TIF projects. After we approve a TIF plan, we have 10 years to activate tax increment financing on those projects. So we have 23 years where TIF can be active, but we have 10 years of time to activate. So you could have an active TIF for 33 years. That is the longest that a TIF could be available for you. And we'll go into that just a little bit more on the next slide too. So like I said, all economic development projects have to be activated within 10 years after the TIF plan, and then we have 23 years with each project to collect TIF. The other thing about TIF is that eminent domain is available, but we have to use it quickly. We have to use it within 5 years. Eminent domain is generally not used with these projects. Almost always it's a developer who has already purchased property or is in line to purchase the property after the TIF is approved. So we don't, I mean, I've been doing this, I have 10 different projects that have been approved in the last couple of years, and we haven't used eminent domain in any of them. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. That doesn't come up too often. The other thing to be aware of is greenfield areas are now prohibited. So a greenfield area is a defined term in the TIF Act. It is any vacant, unimproved, or agricultural property that is wholly outside the incorporated limits of a city, or property that is substantially surrounded by agricultural property, unless the property was annexed into the city in the last 10 years. So this is, and we don't want to get too far into this just because it's very property area based, but generally the statute was changed in 2021 to not allow TIFs on vacant open land, basically. And there are a couple ways to do this. First, I would say, I know you guys are working on annexations, keep doing it, start them, because we don't want to be in 10 years going, oh man, we should have annexed that 10 years ago, now we have a developer who's coming. So that's all, we can talk about specific projects if it comes up, but just for now, be aware of, we need to be annexing property if we want to use it. And of course, we can develop property without TIF, right? That doesn't mean this is not the only way to develop property, but just something to be aware of. And then if you go to the next slide, so, and I think this is a few, yeah. So this is where you can see we have a redevelopment area, the whole redevelopment area, that, let's say, was approved in 2025. We can keep that redevelopment area for 33 years. Within the redevelopment area, you have different redevelopment projects, and those are all activated on different times. Why would we want to have different redevelopment projects? Well, most TIFs, I shouldn't say most, you kind of have two different types of TIF. One that is on, a grocery store and a few pad sites is one general area. You might have a TIF that is very, very large and covers hundreds of acres, and those projects come online on different times, right? We don't want to, if we only have 23 years to get all the money we can out of this, we want to make sure that we have time to actually do it. We don't want to waste 3-4 years of that 23-year clock building the development. That's where the different activation times, the different timelines come into play. TIFs, tax increment financing, is activated by ordinance. So whether a developer wants to activate a project area kind of depends on the developer, right? That's something that we could create a policy on if you had a strong interest in that. But generally, I default to when the developer wants them to be activated. They are done by ordinance, so there's always that risk of a future board not approving that activation ordinance. So that's just up to the developer whether they want to take that risk, whether they want to, wait 2 years while they're developing their building, or whether they want to get it active now to make sure that it can be approved. Because if we're approving a TIF plan, we're probably going to be okay with activating the two, right? We know that board is willing to do that. So that is more of a strategy dependent on the project, the developer, the board, all sorts of factors. Any questions there? Then we go to the next slide. Okay, so TIF timeline. I mentioned this one is a little bit longer than most other incentives. So, like I said, first we will be working with the developer. When they submit the TIF plan, a bunch of other statutory requirements start falling into place. So we want to be in control of when they submit the TIF plan. When we are working on a project that is a TIF project, we will have as a board agreed to the term sheet. We will be working out a few details with the developer, but they wouldn't have submitted their TIF plan yet. So you might think, oh, we're supposed to be seeing a TIF plan. Not yet. There are steps that we take for this. And I'll also mention, for each project that I do, one of the very first things I do is create a timeline that has all of our marks and all of our hits on it. So that will always be as a resource for you all to know and just make sure that we're on track. So first, the developer would submit their plan. When they submit their plan, we then well, I'll talk about the TIF Commission in just a minute, but the TIF Commission will have the first public hearing on the TIF plan. They are the first review body before the TIF plan comes to you for review. When we have that TIF Commission public hearing, we have to provide a 45-day notice to the taxing jurisdictions. That is much longer than any other public notice we have to give for general city projects. So that's what makes TIF longer. If I've had before a developer come and say, I want a TIF in September, I want a TIF done by December. Okay, well, I can tell you right now that's not going to happen because we don't have enough time. We literally don't have enough time based on the statutory requirements. Add, whatever time we spend on a TIF, add 60 days because we have a 45-day notice and then we have a 15-day notice later. So, but that's a little bit into the weeds. So for our purposes now, first we'll have a TIF Commission public hearing, and then after that TIF Commission public hearing, the TIF plan would come to you all for your consideration. Like I said, that could be 2 meetings, it could just be 1. It is an ordinance, just like anything else.
If we make alterations to the plan, do you report back on the timeline and have to do the 45-day notice again?
So that's a good question. It depends. The TIF Act specifies different processes for different periods, but very generally, when we're working on these, we really shouldn't have any changes before, from the board. Generally, the board should be on board with the TIF plan when it is submitted. That's our goal, is that we agree to this TIF plan. This is what we want to do when it is submitted, so that we don't have to deal with amendments and things like that. There is a process for all of that. It depends on whether the TIF Commission has already met or not. So it does get a little complicated, but generally we like it to be set and agreed to. Obviously it has to come to approval, but that we're all on the same page with this plan. I had one more thing on that too. That's okay, it'll come to me. And then after the Board of Aldermen approves it, what I was going to say actually is, we'll talk about the TIF Commission in just a moment, but the important thing is that if the TIF Commission denies, they recommend approval or denial of the TIF plan to the board. If they recommend denial, the types of things that we can reimburse for become much, much smaller. I mentioned earlier we can reimburse for land acquisition costs, we can reimburse for infrastructure improvements, all sorts of things like that. If the TIF Commission recommends denial and the board still approves, then we can only reimburse for demolition costs. So it greatly reduces what we can use TIF for. So our plan is that the TIF plan is set and on general agreement with the board before it's even public, really. That's because there's so many different TIF requirements. If it goes smoothly, it should go smoothly. We should have an idea. I mentioned that we'll be on board with the TIF plan. I will review it before it's submitted. We will be working on it with the developer before it's even submitted. Any questions on timeline? Go to the next slide, please. So your TIF Commission is also based in statute. It depends on what kind of city and what kind of county you are in, but for Willard, we will have 6 commissioners that are appointed by the city. So you would pick your 6 TIF commissioners. And like I said, it's really important that you pick TIF commissioners who are in line with the city's goals and ideas for development, because if they recommend denial, we've got a problem because the costs that we want to reimburse.
Tornado on the ground, we're
So we have 6 commissioners appointed by the city. There's 11 total commissioners, and because there's 6, that means that the 6 city commissioners could, by themselves, recommend approval of this TIF. So that's just something to be aware of when we're picking TIF commissioners. It's really important.
I think you're supposed to do drills today for tornado warning.
They canceled
so I don't
it.
know.
They
Yeah,
canceled it.
but that could be because of, that's why he's probably going off and where our phones aren't going off. I don't think
that's
we have a tornado.
Everybody okay with moving forward? Like, yeah, okay.
Don't you feel safe in this building? Oh, absolutely.
Hey, you know, I've been whining about a new city hall, since it's nothing, we'll finally get one. We'll have to sacrifice some of us for. So, the school district.
So we have 6 commissioners appointed by the city, 2 appointed by the school district, because most commonly when we're talking property taxes, the school district is the one who's most effective. We will also have 2 commissioners appointed by the county, and then there is 1 commissioner who is appointed by all of the other taxing districts. They get to decide, and if they can't decide, we get to move on without them. So it's just, it happens sometimes. Sometimes we can't agree. But like I said, the 6 city commissioners are really important because if we had a contentious TIF, those 6 can recommend approval because they're a majority of the 11. That TIF composition will change for each TIF plan. The TIF commission, the TIF commission is active. Once, you guys don't have one, but if we do have a TIF, we would set up a TIF commission. Your city members typically have 4-year terms, and then the school, county, and other taxing jurisdictions typically serve just for a particular TIF plan. So if we have one TIF plan in 2026, and then we have a new one, a different project in 2028, the school, the county, and the taxing districts will appoint new commissioners. They could be the same, sometimes that happens, but they would appoint new commissioners for each different TIF plan.
And Lindsay, who could be a commissioner?
It can be anybody, whoever you pick. Sometimes for the county, they actually pick the county commissioners.
Can it be an elected official then?
It can be. The city commissioners cannot be Board of Aldermen because you have to approve the TIF plan separately. But yes, it could be elected officials. Like the school district, it could be school board members, it could be the superintendent. Sometimes they appoint, finance-oriented people so they can really look through the finances and make sure they're set there. But it greatly varies on who they pick, yeah. Any other?
They have to be a resident of the city?
I was just ask that.
Generally, no. We could put that in our ordinances that we have to have our city members be residents, but like the county commissioners probably won't be city. The county commissioners probably won't live in the city. The other taxing jurisdictions may not live in the city, and that's okay. We're redirecting their taxes, which is why there is a TIF commission. With other incentives that we'll talk about tonight, this is the only incentive that has a commission like this. And it's just because TIF is larger than the other incentives. But because we're affecting their taxes, they get a review period. But with the 6 city commissioners, we can still get a project forward even if the county and the school district doesn't like it.
In your past project, have you seen hesitancy on other commissioners other than city to
Like not wanting to approve a project?
jump on board with the TIF?
Well, if you hope the school district will vote in favor of your TIF, I will crush your dreams right now. They probably will not vote in favor of it. And that's okay, because we just need a majority approval. The TIFs take a lot of property tax away, so school districts generally don't like them. Now, you might have a good relationship with your school district, it might be a particular project that they do like, they do want, but generally, I have not seen school districts vote in favor. But that's okay, it's a big
safe
commission.
rule of thumb for them though is that you're not losing anything you're already getting,
Right.
and in 20-something years, you'll
You should be getting a
see-
lot more.
Right.
Yes, yeah, and, my boss Joe likes to say, if we're putting butts in seats, the school district is probably not gonna like it. We might have a big TIF that is not putting any butts in seats, and they are in favor of it. It really just depends on the
8,000 of them in my house.
it depends on the school district, where the TIF is, all of that sort of thing. It really just depends.
But that just shows why it's such a big deal that your 6 commissioners that you appoint from the city, if you get 2 who aren't voting for you, you
That's
can
a
lose your
problem.
TIF.
That's a problem.
So this, and this just may be an oversimplified
No,
understanding. I got land that's drawing $100 worth of taxes. If we do nothing, that's all they're ever gonna get is $100 worth of taxes.
There you go.
If I do the tip, you still get your $100, but you don't get the increase until after the tip is paid off.
correct,
So,
correct.
give me the tip.
But you should get more, and that's
Yeah,
what
you'll get
Wes
more
was
later.
talking about. You want to help. That's why education is so important, and having these conversations now with these other jurisdictions, as well as with your citizens, you're letting them know we're bringing in more money, because if your TIF, say your TIF is building the aquarium, to go to the aquarium, I'm gonna stop and get gas, that's somebody you wouldn't have gotten gas from. I'm gonna go get at the t-shirt shop some of those cute t-shirts, but I'm gonna go to this restaurant. So all these tax dollars are coming in because of, that's that whole but-for part that really helps you understand why you're giving that benefit for this development. It's bringing in other aspects.
Yeah. And 2, I said the TIF lasts for 23 years. It generally does last for 23 years. But when we do reimbursable projects, what we build into the development agreement is what we call a reimbursement cap. So if you know that we had that example project that they needed $5 million of funding to finish that project. If we say in the development agreement, you only get that $5 million out of this TIF. If they hit $5 million in year 18, the TIF is done. So it could last 23 years, it could be shorter. It really just depends on the project and how much revenue. And keep in mind, it's sales tax that we're generating mostly in property taxes, so it comes in very small increments. It feels like, oh, they can reimburse a TIF in $5 million in 5 years. It's very small amounts throughout the year, so keep that in mind too. But we build that reimbursement cap into the development agreement to say, you said you were gonna build X. You told us, and you did build X, you only get what we agreed to. If you build a smaller project, you get less reimbursement because you didn't build exactly what you asked, what we told you, what you said that you were going to build. So that's something that's not in the TIF Act. We just include that in the redevelopment and the development agreement. One is a protection for the city, but also for the other taxing jurisdictions. They can also know we are doing a responsible TIF here, that we are tracking it, we understand what they're going to build, we know how much they're going to receive, and when they hit that amount, it turns off, no matter what. Any more questions on TIF? We have one more slide on TIF that is just kind of a summation slide. Advantages of TIF are that we don't have, one, we can use bonds. That is a possibility. There are a few other projects that we can use bonds to, but the big advantage to TIF is that it is a reimbursable project that we are not binding our general obligation funds to if it does not develop. While we want every TIF to develop like it says it does, things happen, and if it doesn't, we're not on the hook.
But there's a little ding to our rating.
Not if it's a reimbursable one. If it's just reimbursement, there's nothing. There was no revenue generated. The developer probably spent $100,000 getting this TIF in place and never got anything back from it. And that's okay. I mean, that doesn't typically happen, but the world is crazy. Who knows what's gonna happen? The other advantage of TIF is that it doesn't only use property taxes. Like we were just talking about the school district, if we have a project that also uses sales taxes, it puts less burden on the school district, on the property tax heavy jurisdictions. So that's something to keep in mind. Usually, outside of TIF, we're usually talking either sales tax or property tax. So this allows us to use both, which is a nice option. It's also a benefit that all the taxing jurisdictions get to have a voice. That is what the TIF Commission does. We are able to, sometimes these projects are big community projects where we might have, a big sports complex that the school district gets to use for a reduced cost. Those are community projects, and the school district gets a say in that too. And they only get a say on the TIF Commission. They're not in, closed session negotiating the terms of the incentives, but they do get a say. The other, benefit is that if we need to use it, eminent domain is available. Like I said, we don't use it too often, but that is an option as well. One other thing that I realized I didn't mention with the development agreement. So we have the preliminary funding agreement. We also typically have in the projects an administrative fee for the ongoing years of administration. When we have our development agreements, we include in there a process in which the developer submits all of their costs of their development, so we can verify, yes, you said it was gonna cost 25 million and you spent 25 million. That obviously has a cost to it, and the developer pays that cost too. Their administrative fee is usually about 2% of the revenues that are generated by the TIF, and then those are used to cover the city's ongoing administrative costs. So our hope is that as we go through this process and then have a TIF active for years afterwards, that the city is not out of pocket any funds in relation to the TIF, that they pay their way, and the developer can also get that administrative fee back in reimbursement costs if it's in their project budget. So they might balk at it, but they get it back eventually. It's part of it. Any other questions on TIF?
So from a liability perspective, if Mike's company applies for a TIF and we do our due diligence and we just don't like what we're seeing in his numbers or his documents, we can arbitrarily just say, no thanks, Mike, we like Wes's better. Wes looks more stable
That's a good question.
than Mike does. Can we arbitrarily say no to Mike and yes to Wes?
So that's a good question, but I will say, it's not arbitrary, because you're basing it on due diligence.
The facts that you
That's what
found.
we're looking at, yeah. You don't have, these incentives, all of these incentives we're talking about tonight are at your discretion. You don't have to approve any of them. And if you feel bad about a developer, maybe we shouldn't go forward with them. That is a legitimate concern. Now, that doesn't mean people do sue over failed projects. That doesn't mean they win lawsuits. We can't, as much as Holly and I would like to, we cannot prohibit people from suing you. So people can still do that. Developers do get mad. We are talking large amounts of money here. But you don't create any precedent. We have a policy that we follow, but there's usually in the policy also a statement that says we can vary this policy dependent on, our determination of whether this is a project we want. So I'm not saying people won't get mad, but they don't have a very good legal argument to say, you should have given me that TIF. Why? We can say no, it's an ordinance, we can deny it. So that's a good question, it's something that we're aware of, but that's also why we don't usually get involved with developers we're nervous about, because they usually have more of the problems.
So
just
you
in general.
can't arbitrarily decide. What you were saying was not arbitrary.
Right.
It was, the numbers don't look good here, but these numbers, and you have a limited amount of funding and.
Yeah, and those,
debt service
and those are good arguments to make too. You can just, a developer can come and say, hey, I want a TIF, and we can say, no, we're not interested. That's okay too, we don't have to investigate it. But having, if we're looking at, should we pick X, Y, and Z developer over the other, having that due diligence backup information is good for our legal arguments against that. But you don't create a precedent when you approve one TIF. They're all projects on their individual basis. It's all dependent on, somebody could come and say, I want to put a grocery store in, and we say, great, that's exactly what we want. Somebody could come in and say, I want to put in a huge industrial development, and we say, that's not what we want. That's okay. That is okay. Just because they ask does not mean we have to grant incentives. Any other questions? We're done with TIF, and we'll get into the other incentives.
The due diligence is so deep.
It is
And
really important.
so huge, that's why I'm not the one doing this presentation and I don't do the TIFs, because we have a mapped out plan for these that Joe has been doing for 15 plus years.
20, I don't think you'd like me to say that, decades. But
Yeah, I was trying not to count the other time. So it's tried and true process to ensure that you are considering the right things. That's one of the benefits of our office is we have those specialties, and so that's why it's in her.
And it's very standard across the state too, to due diligence. You might get a developer who says, you want me to pay $20,000 for this? They've never done an incentive before then. This is standard across the state, that developers pay their costs, that we investigate them. When we do due diligence, sometimes they don't want, the reason that the financial advisor does it a lot is because all of this information is generally an open record. Contracts are closed, and so there are ways that things can be closed, but generally there's no economic development closed record. So generally developers don't want, their deep finances on city files, and that's okay. That's why there's a third party who is doing that and doing those investigations. And then their costs are also covered.
Covered, meaning they come out of that agreement, not
The
out of
funding
the city's.
agreement. Yes, by the funding agreement. Okay, so community improvement districts. I really like community improvement districts. I think they can be super fun. I was just saying before we started that they're usually fairly standard, infrastructure community improvement districts, but they can be really fun too. So first, a SID is it's found in chapter 67. On paper, the SID is a petition process where a group of property owners sign a petition saying, city, we want to do X, Y, and Z available on the SID Act. It can also be, Joe likes to refer to it as an enhanced homeowners association, that you can actually have a property tax that is taxed to the properties in the SID, and then those are collected by the county, just with other property taxes. So instead of having to go knock on people's doors for dues, the county can just collect it, and that's an option for these. There's also, we will see a lot of times a developer will suggest, I want to do a TIF and I want to have a SID, because that TIF doesn't get me that $5 million. The SID adds a little bit more to it, so we can also stack them. A SID is created by ordinance of the city. We'll talk about a transportation development district in just a minute, and that is created by a court. This is just approved by the city. It is a much simpler, quicker process than TIFs, really. Go to the next slide. So a SID, there are a lot of different improvements that we can utilize with a SID. Like TIF, the SID Act expressly states what can be paid for by a SID. And a SID, I should say, we'll get into the funding in just a second. Typically, a SID is an additional sales tax on a specific area. And we'll get into in just a minute about the different funding mechanisms. So basically, it is a retail area that has an additional tax. That additional tax goes to pay for improvements or services that are listed in the SID Act, and they include all sorts of different things. Pedestrian shopping malls, if you're familiar with the trolley in historic Branson, that is a SID that was created actually because of the landing. People were scared that they would just skip over the historic downtown Branson, and that trolley is a SID that will carry people around. The SID just pays for that trolley service. Another one is, if you're familiar in Kansas City, if you're ever downtown, you might see people walking around with yellow jackets, and they say that something like ambassador on the back. That is a SID. Those people walk around picking up trash and acting as ambassadors for downtown. That is also funded by a SID.
So is this like on your, like you get a receipt?
Yeah.
Is that, okay. So
I-
that's what I was asking but I was asking about a PIF, which is a public improvement fee, and that's similar to this, that's what I was asking.
Okay. Yes, so you'll see it is, if we can go to.
You can also use it for security, right?
Well, yes, so there are a lot of different, there's a few new, if you look up SIDs in the news these days, there are a few new options that are available specifically in the St. Louis and Osage Beach areas. So there is one statute that says you can actually hire certified officers by SIDS. Most SIDS can't do that, but you can hire security. I have a downtown SID that is looking at having some open container areas for FIFA World Cup events. They could use a SID to pay for those. You can also, if you can go one more slide.
Yeah.
Part of the services that they provide, we can have cultural and community events. There's all kinds of things we can do with SIDS. There are sidewalk cafes. We can lease street space to the SID or to businesses so that they can expand their premises a little bit. There's just a lot of different fun things we can do with SIDS. Mostly, yes.
I saw parking lots on there.
Yeah.
Publicly owned parking lots, or could that money be used for privately owned parking lots?
Well, so that was actually just what I was about to say, is typically when, like for our example, for a grocery store and a couple pad sites, typically a SID would be utilized to pay for the repaving of the parking lot, for landscaping, if they need an access drive, things like that. That is kind of our boring SIDs, like we just need a little bit of more funding, and this is just a public infrastructure SID. That is very standard. I have one that was just approved for sewer and water infrastructure that needed to go into a development. Those are all very standard SIDs, but they can be a lot more fun.
Now, I might be getting ahead of you here, when you said petition, what numbers are you talking about when it comes to a petition?
So we have to have on the petition, we have to have 50% of owners within the district on a per capita basis and also on an assessed valuation basis. That usually is not too much of a struggle because it is usually property that is owned by the developer. Usually it's, one or two parcels, and that's what the SID is going to be on. But when you have a much larger SID like a historic downtown Branson or a historic just downtown SID, then you just have to make sure that half of the property owners are on board.
So 51% of the business owners in a particular area could vote for a SID, and the other 49% have to live with it.
Correct.
They have to charge the tax.
We can get creative with the SID boundaries. So we can get creative. That's something too that we can think about if there's particular people who are really not interested in it. But yes, if you are in the SID and you have a sales tax SID, I think we can go one more slide. One more, sorry.
That's okay.
There are a lot of things you can do with a SID. But if you have, we can look at those property owners. If it is a sales tax that is going into place, yes, they would have to charge it at their business. Now, they might not have a retail, they might not be a retail sale owner, right? And they don't have any retail sales. They don't have to charge the SID tax. But if they are in that district and they do have a retail business, they do have to charge the sales tax.
Okay, I caught the word parcel. If Rachel owns 4 parcels on Jackson Street, does she get 4 votes on a petition? Does she count 4 times, or does she only count once?
That is
Depends on the dollar
That is
value per
a
property.
good question, but I believe specifically for SID, I believe each parcel has their own. There are some others, like in Neighborhood Improvement District, each owner actually only has 1 vote, but for SID, each parcel has its own petition it would sign. And what happens is that one person drafts the SID petition, the SID Act explains what has to be in there, like the TIF plan is just some figures and stuff. And then we submit the SID petition with the signatures already compiled. So when we have a SID that is pushed through, we will go through each property that signs on to make sure, yes, their assessed valuation does meet that level, they have to include it in the SID petition, and that they are the actual owners. If we get into like a historic downtown, we have to make sure that the property owners are actually the property owners of the properties. If like a trust owns it, the trust has to sign. It can be a little bit complicated that way. But generally, we're looking at properties that the developer already owns or controls or has affiliated interests in.
So theoretically, I might just be a little slow.
No.
It should be normal. If one owner owned shopping center X and another owner owned all of shopping center Y that are right next to each other, are very close to each other, could those 2 owners vote for a SID tax for their properties?
Yes, if you have just one property, one parcel, yes, you can have a SID petition just signed by that one property owner.
So it's ownership and it's voters, and your voters are different.
Well, yes, yeah. So when you have a SID, we have a SID petition that is filed. The board will then vote on whether we do want to have that SID or not. Then, if we approve the SID, then the voters of the SID district will vote to whether or not a sales tax should be.
But there's only 2 voters, right?
Right, but that's okay.
Or there
That's
may be
okay.
none.
Because we only need 50% or more. Does that make sense?
There
Or
may
is
not
it-
be residents in those properties. So your example
So it
were
could be
2
one
commercial
owner.
properties, no voters, 2 property owners,
And
right?
those-
Yes,
But
2
if
property
you've got
owners, one property owner owns all of the commercial buildings in this complex.
And nobody's living in
No one lives
those
there, it's totally
So-
commercial. And then right down the road is another
connected.
complex or
Yes.
row of businesses, all businesses, no residential,
No
owned by one other person.
So 2
So we
owners,
only got 2 owners that
two
own
separate
a bunch of
complexes.
commercial properties.
Right.
But they
So
still leave.
think in terms of your Hancock determines I can't be taxed unless you get a vote, right? So that's, you guys as a board say, yeah, we're gonna use this mechanism. Then it goes back to the voters. It is not uncommon that there be no voters because it's all commercial, no one's living there.
And then just that property owner is the
So then it's
voter.
the property owner
Which would be
vote.
similar to where the Apple Market is, one owner for all of that, right?
I see the East Center and
And
then,
East Center is also
Yeah.
the same way.
And are they next to each other?
they're about a block away.
They could be their own separate SIDs.
That's what I
They
mean.
Yeah, but they cannot be a SID when they're not connected.
So they have
Your
to be
boundaries, yeah, they can each be their own SID,
Uh,
but if they neighbor, you
One, they
can
have
make
to
it
be
one
connected.
SID.
They have
So,
to join
It has to be
properties.
contiguous.
so like you've got Westport and Kansas City and you've got the Plaza, those are 2 different SIDs that have totally different powers, totally different boards, totally different uses. I don't know, I don't know Springfield SIDs enough to be able to use a.
I know
local
either,
example.
but
I
yeah.
apologize.
most of them.
Yeah, I assume the downtown area, because I know they had a parking
Commercial
determination.
street is gonna be a.
I thought.
It's a TIF, I'm not sure if it's a SID.
Okay.
If the C
Well-
Street development, it's a TIF, I don't know if there's a SID. Commonly, the SID is perceived as, like, we vote on it. So it's real intimate, that's why Joe talks about it being like an HOA. Think of it kind of in those terms, we're deciding what happens. So you see that mechanism used in high crime areas where the commercial owners are like, we need protection, we aren't gonna be a burden on the city, and so we need our own entity that does that, and there's a lot of them in Kansas City that utilize that SID for that, or the expense of keeping the outer area nice. You see it also in entertainment districts, because they wanna have more funding to allow those entertainment district designations.
And we're getting way ahead, just
No,
shut up and we're getting to it. Who determines how that money's spent
So.
and how it's spent?
Sure, so first, in the SID petition, they have to list what they're going to use the money on. So they can only do, that petition gets approved by the board and can only be modified by approval of the board. So A, they can only use it for what's in the SID petition. B, what we commonly use SIDs for is an additional tax on a TIF area. This is another economic activity tax. So if you have a TIF and you have a SID overlapping it, half of those SID revenues are given to the TIF through the special allocation fund, through regular TIF uses. When we have a SID that we approve, we also say in the development agreement that you're only going to use the SID for these specific purposes. So they have both the SID petition, if there is a TIF plan, they also have the TIF plan that they have to abide by. And if we approve a TIF, I will always recommend that we have a development agreement, and then actually, the SID is a separate political subdivision. So it itself will also enter into an agreement with the city. There's a developer.
So there's an
the
actual
city.
plan laid out, this
Yes,
is how much you
there
have,
is.
this is who controls the purse strings,
Yes.
and this is when it needs to be done. If you say that you
Yes.
need this money for X and Y, then it needs to be spent on X and Y
Yes.
within this amount of time.
Yes, and the board has approval of their budget. So each year, if you approve a SID, each year their budget will come to you and you will approve it. And it should, I mean,
Not the SID board, you guys.
you will approve it, yes, the Board of Aldermen will approve it. We don't, and typically, I mean, you know, there's examples of SIDs where it goes wrong, right? There's always the bad examples, but typically when we use SIDs, they are for specific purposes. There's usually not issues with budget stuff, there's usually not those concerns. We always keep track of it, of course, but we usually don't have those problems because the developer builds the parking lot, the infrastructure, they get reimbursed over 27 years. There's nothing else to use that money on. They've already paid for they are paying for their project costs through the reimbursement. So most of the time, if these are connected with a larger development, they will be very standard. And yes, we will make sure that they are only spending the money on what they spend it on. Like the TIF, if we reimburse, as it is typically how we do it, the SID will generate money after they have built those improvements, and then that sales tax will reimburse the developer over 27 years or less time than that. So there's not usually new things they want to spend money on. Some SIDs, I know, like a historic downtown SID, you might have ongoing things, and we want to spend this money on X, Y, and Z now, and we can deal with those too, but.
Sir, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but did you have a question?
No, you answered it.
Oh,
Perfect.
that's new. That's something new and exciting.
Think in terms of a SID solving the problem without having to have the city solve the problem. And her happy fun part of it is when it's not what we think is a boring problem, but a benefit that really is needed within that SID.
A lot of times it's, we want this from the city, but we don't have the money, that's not what our job is, we can't do that, you know? We would love to have sidewalk cafes too, but that's not what we work on, so the SID can do that. Just a few more things on SIDs. Like I said, it is a separate political subdivision of the city, so they are required to file annual reports, they are required to comply with the Sunshine Law. We include, I mentioned we would have an agreement with the district and the city. I include in there stuff that like they have to provide us copies of the Sunshine, you have to provide us meeting notices because they do have to comply with the Sunshine Law, so they also have to give them to us so that we know of the SID. It is a separate political subdivision of the city, but sometimes people don't, the public doesn't see that, doesn't understand that, so they may feel like they need to hold you accountable for a SID, and you say, what? I'm not on that board, that is not my problem. So we include in the cooperative agreement different benchmarks for them to hit so that we can be sure that the SID is going well. It's not our responsibility, it's not our district, but people connect it to us because we approved it. So we do put in protections for you to make sure that yes, the SID is doing what it needs to do. And there, I mean, well, we commonly use, actually one developer attorney uses, has a lot of the development that we do economic development projects, and they have a very, very good paralegal who runs all of their SIDs. She knows exactly what's going on.
And from a mechanic standpoint, their dollars go directly to their accounts, or do they come into the city's general account and then we fund it?
So we.
Or does that money come out of our?
So it is a sales tax that is collected by the Department of Revenue. We can vary how we want to do it, but typically what happens is that the Department of Revenue sends that money to the city, and then the city disperses that money to the district based on, yes, you did spend that money on your street improvement, yes, you did finish that project. That can be very dependent on how, you know, how we actually, if your financial director is going, oh, I don't want to do that, we can work on how we want to do that, but that's generally what we do, is that it's collected by the state like every other tax, and then it comes to the city and we disperse it out.
Does anybody here that has connections or sat in on some of the chambers meetings, have they had any type of discussions regarding this?
So these kinds of trainings,
But they
that's
know-
why
they
getting
know
the
we're
word
working
out is so important.
They know we're working on this.
And the other thing is, a SID can only get taxes because they're a SID. So sometimes people will hear about this and they're like, oh, let's do that, but not go through the SID part. You can't get tax money, you can't get, and that's the funding. The funding mechanism does not exist but for this SID, it is the funding mechanism.
And there are a few other funding mechanisms too. We use sales taxes a lot, that's really the most common. But we can assess property taxes as well. We can also have special assessments. We'll talk about it with NIDs, but generally the special assessments should be some sort of uniform process against the properties. They can't just be like, property A, you get 90%, property B, you get 10%. But we don't use those too often. There's also user fees that the SID can charge, just like the city does if they have some service that people could charge for. And then some cities, Springfield and Liberty, get to have business licenses, but most SIDs do not get that offering. Again, if that's something you want, talk to your state legislators, because that's how any of this changes. But right now, it's just Springfield and Liberty that do that. And like I said, typically we're looking at sales taxes. Sometimes we're looking at a city initiated, we need to put in X improvement, what can we do? And that's kind of where we look more at the property taxes or special assessments, but most commonly we are at a sales tax. And it is a sales tax in 1/8%, so it could vary from 0 to 1%, but commonly it's just 1%.
So again, very simple, neutral.
It is, and I should say too, I didn't get into the timeline of SIDs, but we have to give 15 days notice before we have a public hearing on whether we are going to approve a SID or not, and that is the only notice we have to give. So a SID can be up and done and negotiated in 2 to 3 months, really. It is a much simpler process than TIF.
So on a SID, we've got 4 restaurants on Jackson Street that decide to come together and say, we want to have an additional tax for what we sell.
Right.
That's gonna pay for our sidewalk cafes on these 4 restaurants that we are all connected.
Correct.
And so these 4 restaurants on Jackson Street are gonna now have awnings and places to sit.
That's exactly right.
And something to watch, I just did a quick search, but on February 2nd, the North Glenstone Community Improvement District filed a petition in Springfield to include the east and west sides of Glenstone between I-44 and
But Kearney, I think we done a Kearney.
is it Kearney? I would guess that's where it is. And so that can kind of give you a real world idea of how that works. There is the downtown SID as well. You don't see SIDs as robustly as you see them in Kansas City. They really become neighborhood identities, commercially.
And two, like you said, you would have, sometimes what happens is that there's a sewer line that's out that only services these specific properties. Those property owners maybe can't pay for what they need to, so they could form a SID to cover those costs. That's something that we see often too, is that there's some sort of public improvement that the city is not responsible for and these people don't have the funds for, but if they have a retail space, or we can work on that. So that's what we see sometimes too.
That's just, but so now as a consumer of their goods, I would see on my receipt a percent of tax that I'm now paying to them, for that.
Yes, you would have,
It makes sense. We were, I think, in Oregon, and their whole downtown district, it was amazing and just beautiful. But they had multiple trash cans, and we saw a couple of guys walking by, pulling the bags, tying them off, replacing the bags, and then I saw a trash truck, and I told my wife, I was like, well, that's cute. It was a quarter-sized, a tiny little trash truck. Come by, and somebody else throwing them in, and he said, I talked to the guy about it, he said, yeah, it was a tax improvement.
yeah.
So that's what this would have been.
Exactly, and all of these tools are used pretty much, I think, in all 50 states. So if you go on, vacation this summer to a nice area, just look around and you might start seeing, oh, that's the North Hills Improvement District. That's what it is. You're paying an extra sales tax. You probably don't know it. Some people, keep in line of what the sales taxes are. A lot of people don't. But that is something that we can think about with your policy too, is you can say we're not allowing a SID that has a total with all the other sales taxes that brings the sales tax to 10% or something like that. That could be something that we look at too. That's common, like, sometimes some cities have multiple, like you might have a huge downtown SID, and then a specific business might wanna have another one on top of that. That's okay, as long as they're paying for different things, but then that business has a 2% additional sales tax. So it's just something to be aware of. A lot of times I find that consumers don't really see that, but that doesn't mean they don't. And that's something that if you're a business owner and you wanna add that additional sales tax on, that's your choice to do so, and the consumer's choice to spend money or to not spend money there.
And online shopping has a big deal, big difference in that, so there's a lot of people who would go shop in the plaza and then deliver it to your house. So if my purchase goes to my home, that's my user, right? So
And this doesn't go against the total taxable amount.
No.
It's totally separate.
totally
Totally
separate. This is not a city tax, this is a
District
SID tax.
tax.
Yep.
A SID is a different political subdivision of the city.
Just like your your Green County park tax.
Any other questions on SIDs?
Is there a time limit on these?
So it is 27 years.
27.
They used to be perpetual, so you might see that occasionally with some SIDs, but now, after 2021 or so, they're only 27 years. And you can extend a SID after that time period is up, but we have to have another public hearing and you have to get the petitioners to sign on again. But generally, we look at 27 years.
And a vote.
Yes, yes. Any other questions?
This is a weird question, but
No.
are they taxable? So in some places, the SID is actually taxable.
So the SID can have, you mean like property taxes or something like
Just
that? Like,
sales
do they have
tax.
to? So generally, the SID, it has a separate board of directors, but the SID most likely won't have any property. They won't have really any employees. It's just an independent board that
Well, I
meets
mean,
and
like on your
decides.
receipt, it'll actually tax the.
Yes, it'll show, it is a separate sales tax, so it'll show on your receipt, this is your 1% SID sales tax. Is that?
No, but I'll keep going, you're fine.
Okay, well, I'm all done with SIDs,
Okay.
but,
I may email you or something.
okay, sure, yeah, that's fine, yeah. Okay, then we can go on to transportation development districts. So TDDs, I think the worst acronym of the bunch, is just TDD. Sound like I'm stuttering. It is very much like a SID, but TDDs were statutorily authorized prior to SIDs, so it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more complex. Where I said before with SIDs, we have a petition that the Board of Aldermen reviews and then approves. Instead, with a TDD, we actually have to file in court and actually sue if it's going to be a city street, we would actually sue the city. If stick with me, if it
Raised by an attorney.
it was. This is why I said SIDs are a lot easier. This was older and more complicated. But if it is going to be like a MoDOT highway, you would actually sue MoDOT, and then we have to go into court and the judge says, why are we here? And we say, we want to have a sales tax that pays for transportation improvements, just like a SID does. But here we have to go to court to authorize it. And for that reason, we don't see a lot of TDDs, and you've probably driven through many that you just don't realize. If you come across a highway intersection that has like a fast food restaurant and a lumber yard and a gas station, that might be a TDD, because there's a sales tax on those properties that, just like the SID, reimburses the developer for the transportation improvements that they made. And there's a lot of different types of improvements. It can be just an interchange. Sometimes you might have a very large development and the TIF is paying for the buildings that are being built, but we also need to put in a new road. Then we might have a TDD on top of that to pay for the road specifically. If you can go one slide. This is a list of all of the different things we can do. If you're familiar with the streetcar in Kansas City, that is a TDD. That is what paid for the streetcar. And that is also a 1% tax. Again, like SIDs, it can go in 1/8%, but we usually see 1% based on the project.
And so
Super
because,
complicated, super technical.
It is, that's why we use, SIDs are a lot simpler, easier, cheaper. We use those, a lot of this can be done with SIDs, so we just see it more often. I do have In 2 years, I've had one TDD.
So because the state would receive those taxes for the highway or the, whatever, that department receives those taxes, the city would then, that's why they have to go to them, sue them, and get the court to say that the state now is reimbursing you?
Well, we have to go into court because the statute says so.
Sure.
It's not like, that is really the answer. It could be a simpler process where we don't have to go to court, but it's not, we just have to do that because they say so, basically.
Sure, but the money is still coming from the state or the highway department, to go
Yes.
back to the city.
So it would be a sales tax that is still collected by the state, and then like a SID, a TDD has a board of directors, and then that sales tax goes to typically the city, and then the city will reimburse it back to the TDD, is typically what would happen, yeah.
Are there for specific businesses within an area that gets the tax, or?
So it depends on, just like the SID, we would create boundaries of the TDD, and that just depends on what kind of project we need, what businesses are involved. If we have a sales, if you can go over slide. If we have a sales tax TDD, of course we need retail places to have that sales tax be generated. You could have a TDD that is just property tax based on the properties that are immediately benefited by the transportation improvement. And the same thing, you could have a special assessment just on the properties that are benefited. Like for example, if you have, like if you are a city that has a lot of interstate traffic, and you need a better intersection for people to get off and to get on a gas station to get you sales tax, more sales tax for your city, that intersection can be improved through a TDD. It could be through a sales tax. It could be through a property tax or a special assessment on like that gas station. That gas station is benefited by the new interchange that is directing customers to it. So it just depends on the boundaries, the project, what we're looking at. Like the SID, we do have voters who would vote in the sales tax. So again, that depends on what kind of businesses are there. Usually it is property owners who are the voters because we don't usually have a residential TDD. And then of course we can have tolls. We don't have tolls a lot in Missouri, but you can have a toll on a road or a transportation improvement.
Good luck, they're so popular in southern Missouri.
Good luck.
Shoo.
So that's all I have on TDDs. They're not used very often because they are a little bit more complicated, but it is something that we can look at if we need to. Sometimes we have very large projects that need all the funding they can get, and that might be something that we look at, but typically this one is not used as much. Any
But the
questions?
development of a stormwater area that builds up for a road, that could be relieved through the TDD for the buildup.
Yeah, how depending on how connected it is, yeah, that could be. So we can go to the next slide. So next we have neighborhood improvement districts. I think you all are a little bit familiar with this. Neighborhood improvement districts are different than what we just talked about with SIDs and TDDs. An NID is not a special district. It does not have a board of directors. It is a district, but it's not a political subdivision. There's not a board of directors. And most typically how NIDs are used are that we can get bonds through the NID process. And that is a city issued bond. It is not backed by the general obligation of the city, but is backed by special assessments on property. So for example, an NID, an easy example of an NID is I'm going to put in a new subdivision and I have to pay for the public infrastructure, but I don't have enough money to do that. So I take out a bond through city approval processes, and then on each of those residential developments, I add an additional $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 onto the home price so that those bonds get paid off by the purchaser of the house, essentially. The developer can pay them off himself, but most commonly what we see, because the special assessments are so high, is that they are incorporated into selling a piece of property. This, again, is one that is not used so often because you have to get a large bond to pay for the infrastructure, and then you have to pay special assessments to pay back that bond. Usually that is a large investment for a developer, and we have other options, right? The SIDs and the TIFs that do that a little bit easier on the developer. But this is something that sometimes people do want to utilize.
And is useful in areas that are highly undeveloped. So not a place within the city where the infrastructure already exists, but an area where you're doing a heavy lift for that development.
And there are two different ways we can approve an NID bond. First, it could be initiated by the city and approved by the voters like other bonds of the city. Or the owners can petition to have a bond, to have an NID bond. This is also what people use sometimes if there's a particular group of property owners that need to make their own public improvement or something like that. They can divide the cost amongst themselves via these special assessments that are then paid throughout years with their property taxes. There is a few, if we go to the next slide. So this is just a listing of different things we can use with NIDs. There are specifics in the statute of what we can use them, but generally we're looking at public improvements. This is one that we would have to have bond counsel with because they all, and just to be clear, Holly and I, we don't serve as bond counsel. So if we have any bonds that we would want to issue, we would assist the services of, I mean, there's a couple choices out there, there's not many, but Gilmore & Bell is the most common bond counsel, and there's a few others around, yeah. I lost where I was going on that. But these are, but generally we are looking at public improvements, and then those bonds are paid off by the special assessments on the properties.
So essentially, it's the entity that gets the benefit is paying for the benefit,
Yes.
as opposed to spreading it out through the city.
Yes, and this is another one where when we evaluate what those special assessments should be on different properties, there's a lot of different ways we can do that, but it generally has to be equal. We can't say property owner A, you have to pay 90% of this, property owner B, you pay 10%. But we could look at, well, you know, we're building a road, and this property is more benefited by this new road than property back here. That property back there may get a smaller special assessment. We just have to have good calculations and understand these are not just arbitrary, you get this much, you have to pay this much. But what I was saying with bond counsel too is that this is still a bond of the city, so we are still limited by how much we can issue in bonds. So that's something just to be aware of too, that when we start looking at, when a developer comes in and says, I want an NID bond, well, do we even have bond capacity? Are we even okay with that? So that's just something to be aware of. And then those have to be paid off in 20 years. Any questions on NIDs? Those, like I said, are not used too often, primarily because there's that large special assessment. It's hard to place that on people sometimes for developers, but it does have its place. Okay, so chapter 100, we have talked about TIF, which redirects taxes. We have talked about different sales taxes that we can put on entities. Chapter 100 is a different type of incentive. This is a property tax abatement incentive. So Chapter 100 is authorized by Chapter 100 RSMO, that's why we call it Chapter 100. The basic concept is that the city issues bonds that are not general obligation bonds of the city, they are not voter approval bonds, but the city issues bonds for a particular industrial development. We're generally looking at, like distribution centers, warehouses, office space, anything that is in the interstate commerce that can be used for Chapter 100. So we issue bonds for that development. Those bonds are used to pay for that development. And then through that process, the city becomes the owner of the property that is being developed. And then because the city becomes the owner, the property is tax exempt because the city is tax exempt. So that's how we effectuate that tax exemption. The city becomes the owner of that industrial project. If you ever look, you can look in through GIS and, like, for example, there's a huge Chapter 100 up Kansas City way with a whole bunch of different industrial warehouses. You can see on there that the city owns those properties. That's why they own those properties. It's just part of the process. To receive tax abatement, the city becomes the owner of the property. Now, that doesn't mean we are responsible for the property. In the bond process, there are a couple different agreements, and one of those is a lease purchase agreement where the city and the developer leases, or I'm sorry, the city leases the property back to the developer, and that cost of lease is the debt service on the bonds. So we don't make any money off of this, but we lease the property to the developer. Those lease proceeds pay the debt service on the bonds. And because the city owns the property, they get tax exemption through it. The third benefit of Chapter 100 is that they can also utilize the city's sales tax exemption certificate, and that allows them to basically buy construction materials for their development sales tax free. And that is a useful benefit because typically for a lot of cities, where the developer is purchasing the materials from aren't the city. So this is a benefit we can give the developer that doesn't impact us. A lot of times it impacts the state and the county more than it impacts the actual city. The only thing with that is that we can't track the sales tax exemption. They have a piece of paper and they can use it where they use it. So we do put in, like I said, we have that development agreement that we do have protections for the city. We tell them they can only use it on this project. We tell them that if they misuse it, they will be responsible for the taxes that they should have paid. And I mean, generally there's no issues, right? But I mentioned that because I had a project earlier this week where an alderman was upset that we don't have a way to track it. We don't have a way to track it. The way that it would be, that we would find out there was a problem would come from the state, because the state is more involved in that than the city actually is. But like I said, we generally don't have problems with that. They know they can only use it on construction materials, and it is only active during the time that they are actually constructing their building. So they might have a bond that is going on 10, 20 years, but if they're only building for 2 years, they only get to use that exemption then. That's a nice.
You audit that. Well, do they have a permit? Will they have a permit for that project?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, that's actually a good question. We haven't talked about that at all. When we do these projects, they still have to comply with all city codes, where they still have to go through the permitting process, site plan process, all of that. So we won't, because we can ask them to give us receipts, right? And we usually do ask them to give receipts for any usage in the city, so that we know, is somebody actually utilizing this in the city? We don't know. But there is no way to track it, because they could just not give us receipts.
So they don't have to give you their purchase receipts?
We can ask for them. We can totally ask for them. But if they use it somewhere else and we don't know, there's no way for us to track.
They just don't give you those receipts?
They just don't give us those receipts,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
And that's not.
If they're building 2 building projects and we order all the material in that.
Well, and I'll say this too. With like the last project that I just utilized a sales tax exemption for, they had approximately $300,000 that they saved with sales tax, with their sales tax exemption. So that is a large amount of money, right? But when we're talking $25 million projects, that's a small amount of money. So it's not as if they're getting a huge benefit. They I hope, I trust that they
It's
don't
like a
use it,
coupon.
but it is, it's a coupon that you can use, and generally it doesn't affect the city. So it's a nice way to get them some upfront cash savings. Because when we're talking about tax abatement too, they receive that benefit year over year over year. This is an upfront cash savings that could help them a little bit right now. Okay. So then we go to the next slide. So like I said, this is generally for warehouses, research and development facilities, offices, distribution centers, anything that is really involved in interstate commerce. Really the only thing that we cannot use a Chapter 100 on is single-family homes. We could use it on apartments that are rented and that cash flow continues through the state when you pay rent, but when you are just the one individual owner of the home, then we can't say that there's any interstate commerce with that. So that is pretty much the only thing we can't utilize Chapter 100s for, and retail generally. And then if we can go to the next slide. So like I said, we would still have a development agreement for a Chapter 100, but there will be more agreements with the bond purchase, and that includes a lease purchase agreement. Like I said, the city is the owner of the property, but really it's in name only. The developer would still be required to comply with, taxes that they do have to pay, any maintenance of city code, things like that. The city is not responsible for that property. And I think yes, okay. So on this, I said the city becomes the owner of the property and then they receive tax exemption because the city is tax exempt. We don't have to give them that full 100% abatement. That might be too much when we go through our due diligence and say this is how much value we want to give them, that 100% abatement might be too much. So in that case, we would require them to pay pilots, and here is a different type of pilot with this project compared to TIF projects. This would be a payment in lieu of tax that we determine based on how much abatement we think they should receive. You might have a project that receives 75% abatement, and then they have to pay the rest of that tax that should have been on that building, but for it being tax exempt. So you might have let's say their tax responsibility should be $10,000. I'll use an easy number for my own math purposes. Their property tax that they should pay that year is $100. If we want to offer them 75% abatement, that 75%, $75 is abated, but they are still required to pay that $25 to taxing jurisdictions. And typically, with these Chapter 100 projects, we also require that they still pay the base value of property. So again, taxing jurisdictions should still be receiving some benefit from these projects. It may not be 100% property tax, but you do get some. We can here include, typically we're looking at real property most commonly. We can include personal property as well. So especially if you're looking at, a grocery store that has all of these refrigerators that need to come in, that's all personal property that we can also abate. We don't have to. So that doesn't always include, sometimes we can, and that's a good fact for taxing jurisdictions too, that we can say you're still going to receive the personal property value. That is an option, but that really just depends on the developer of the project, the city. It just depends on how much incentive we want to give. Any question? And I will say too, with Chapter 100s, sometimes it can be a very basic 75% abatement, 25% pilots. It can be more complicated. Chapter 100 is a job creation tool. So if you have an industry who's coming who says, I'm gonna bring 30 jobs in the next year and then I'm gonna bring 10 more in the next year, we can say, okay, that sounds great. You get this abatement if you bring 30 jobs in. If you bring those 10 more, you get a little bit more abatement. But if you don't get any more abatement. So that's something that we can think about too, if there's any certain, I'm gonna build a second building in 2 years. That's great, I hope you do. And if you do, we can give you some tax abatement. But if not, we don't have to deal with that. Any questions on Chapter 100? We commonly these days see a lot of Chapter 100s with SIDS because it offers that property tax abatement and it gives that sales tax redirection that TIF offers, but it's a much simpler, easier process than the TIF. Like Chapter 100, you only have to give 20 days notice to taxing jurisdictions rather than that 45-day notice. So this is a combination that we see a lot just because TIF has gotten so complicated. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned 353s last time when I was here. This is an incentive that I really like because it can be very, very flexible. Very basically, we would find a particular area, and I say, when we do city-initiated 353s, we would find a particular area that is blighted, that needs some redevelopment, and then we could offer property owners to take part in that incentive, and if they redevelop in such an amount of money, if they have a project that they have $10,000 worth of costs or $100,000, just depending on what we want to look at, then they can receive some tax abatement after their project is done. That's what we've done that commonly a few times with historic downtown districts where the city initiates 353, says we want to see this kind of redevelopment in this area. Property owners, go for it. We're not responsible, we're not going to take your property, but if you want to participate and you want to get tax abatement, you can spruce up your property and get some tax abatement. The other way, developers can use this tool too. We do sometimes have 353s that are just on one property, and then they receive some tax abatement for the project that they do. That is an option, but currently what I'm really excited about are these historic downtown 353s. If we can go to the next slide. So the tax abatement that is available, this is what is the base tax abatement that's available in the statute. So for the first 10 years, we could offer 100% abatement for the improvements, and then any increase in the real property value. Like I've been saying with other incentives, that base value of the real property still flows to the taxing jurisdiction. And that is just in the first 10 years. There is an option then for an additional 15 years after the initial 10 years, in which there can be at least 50% abatement of both the real property and the improvements, the structures on the building. This is a really flexible tool. Like, we were talking with TIF, that TIF tells us exactly what sales taxes we have to collect by TIF. This can be very flexible and up to exactly what the city or the developer is looking for, which is a nice option. But it does abate only property taxes. Any questions on 353s? Next slide, please. My last one is an incentive that is mostly useful for retail developments that have a sales tax generated by that development. Under just one statute, 7220, the city is able to enter into agreements with private developers to develop public infrastructure, basically. If a developer needs to add on to their sewer, we can say, you do that work and we will reimburse you through the additional tax that your business generates. So that would be the city saying, we get 1% general revenue from your business. If you build this improvement that you need, we will give you back 50% of that over the next 10 years. That can be that number can vary based on what kind of sales tax were generated and how long the city wants to have an agreement for. But if they generate sales tax, we can reimburse them through the sales tax that their business generates for essentially public improvements. This might be utilized, it's sort of like a SID, right? That they create a public improvement and then they get reimbursed. It is usually much smaller. It might be one specific improvement that a development needs, but because they would be working on public infrastructure, they may still be required to pay prevailing wage or to have a performance bond. So it is a tool that is useful, but is also a little bit limited just because of limitations on public works for the city. But it is something that's available if they generate a sales tax. If they don't have a sales tax, there's nothing to give back, right? So this is one that we can keep in mind, in particular if we have just a little bit of a gap, a little bit of something, or a small development, they may want to look at the sales tax reimbursement agreement. So just my last slide is, I think we talked about this very briefly last time, but we mentioned the chamber and different sorts of economic development opportunities and groups. Of course, like we mentioned this afternoon, just this evening, is the chamber aware of these tools? These are all tools that all of these entities should be aware of and talking about business, talking about with development and business that wants to come into town. A lot of projects, when we do larger projects in particular, sometimes having the backing of the chamber really helps. And that really helps also when they understand the tool and know what they're talking about too. So sometimes especially if we have large projects that we need to make sure we have some public support for, we might talk with the chamber or a particular group ahead of time and just make sure that they understand how the TIF or a different project works. What we don't want is to have misinformation out there, so we can always consider looking at or talking to specific groups and making sure that they understand what the project that we're considering is. The worst thing is to say, I don't want a TIF, I don't want a new tax. That is a problem, because that is not what we're doing with a TIF. So we wanna make sure that these entities also know, and of course, you know, the Missouri Department of Economic Development knows what these tools are, but they can also be partners that we use. Sometimes we get requests from, I've had varied experiences with the Department of Economic Development. Sometimes they're a little slower than us. Sometimes they can get a they can issue their own sales tax exemption a little bit earlier than we can, which helps the developer move a little bit faster while we're still going through our processes. So there's different things that different entities can do, but it's always a good idea just to be on board with them. And there's a ton of economic development resources on the state's website too. They have a lot of good sort of, you know, summaries of incentives, and they also have a lot of state-specific incentives. These incentives that I mentioned tonight are incentives that the city can offer. There's also state incentives, and we could combine some with the state offering too. So it's just something to be aware of and be thinking of when we're looking at projects. You know, the state is interested in industries coming to Missouri, so if we're looking for somebody who is coming in new, that might be something where if we can't get the full deal done, the full amount that the developer wants, maybe the state has something to offer too that we can work on with them as well, so.
And if local business owners wanted a contact or someone that, you know, help lead them through this process, is that the organization, the state they would go to?
So typically, if somebody needs help going through the approval, the incentive process, we would recommend a developer attorney. We work with, you know, we can work with any attorneys. I don't mind who I work with, but having attorneys on the developer side who know incentives and have done them before helps it go a lot smoother and cheaper and easier for everybody involved. So generally, if an applicant is looking for some help, I would direct them to an attorney, but there are a lot of resources at the state too. I was thinking about this earlier today. When the incentive started, when I was talking about, you know, city-backed bonds in the early 2000s, when that was going on, a lot of cities did not have their own representation. They had the developer and the developer attorney telling them how this would work.
And they perceived that to be advice for them as an attorney, when really that attorney was having a beneficial negotiation with the city.
Yeah, and so I want to make sure that the developers have their own counsel, because I'm not giving them legal advice. I can't give them tax advice. I am working through the incentive process, and then what you do with that agreement afterwards is your business. So it's really helpful when they do have an attorney who knows what's going on. That's primarily who I would direct them to. Yeah. And then of course, we would have an incentives policy too that we could utilize and give them, that gives them a rundown of how all of this works. That sometimes is difficult to read through for just a new developer who doesn't know what's going on, but it is a helpful resource for them as well.
Which is what you vote on. You guys decide what your plan
Yes.
is.
So any questions, concerns, overwhelmed feelings?
Super excited.
I know, it's a lot, it is. It is a lot of information, but it is really exciting. Yeah.
But it's tools. It's tools and knowledge that now when you're, you know, when you're at the soccer game, you can talk about it, or when you're out to dinner. Yeah, I mean, it is the most cool conversation for losers.
Well, and also, it's really fun to drive down the road and say, that wasn't there 2 years ago, I worked on that project, I approved that thing.
And you will start seeing things in a different way. Like she said, you'll start realizing, oh, that's a boundary for a SID, and that's what this is. It's not that business has it. And so it does make you much more knowledgeable about how other cities develop. But then you look at that and go, oh, I like that. I want to bring that here. We're not asking you to reinvent the wheel. Wheels out there, there's lots of wheels, lots of different kind of wheels.
And there's a lot of, you know, I ran through the statutory requirements tonight. There are a lot of creative things we can do here. We can, you know, I had a project last summer that had a TIF, a SID, a TDD, a Chapter 100, and a sales tax reimbursement agreement. That was a lot of work, you know, we can do that again, that sounds great, but there are also a lot of things we can do with just 2 incentives or just 1 by themselves. There's a lot of creative ways to think about problems.
You use the 353 a lot for downtown
Yeah.
improvements and being able to maintain a downtown area. So it gives me the ability to improve my property and use those tax dollars back in.
And I really like it when a developer comes and says, okay, what do we, I need X. What incentive can we use for that? How can we get this done? And we can be creative and think about it in a different way. And that's really fun too. Just depends on each project, each developer, and what we're looking for. So, like I said, I'm not going away. I don't expect you to retain all of this. And I expect really when we have a project or we're sitting in closed session and talking about an incentive, you guys will understand what we're talking about, the bigger picture. And then really, I think you'll really learn it and see it when we go through a whole process once. And you'll say, okay, that's step 1, step 2, step 3. That's what I really like to do. Like I said, I'll have a timeline for every project so that we know exactly what we need to do and when we need to do it too. So I'm excited. We'll see where we get going here.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Right on time.
This is huge.
Yeah. Super.
Thank you guys.
Thank you. Wes,
It is super.
got any city administrator remarks?
Oh, you know I can't let it slide by without saying something, right?
Say it.
What's that mean, Holly? So just a heads up, you know, obviously Parks, there's been some changes. I want to give some support and encouragement. We've got Emily and Brenda, they've been doing a fantastic job. We met with them this week. Mike's been meeting with them. They have really stepped up, and I appreciate that. As a result of some of our discussions, there is a program budget being developed for one of our programs, and if it meets with, I'll probably run it by you, that's why I look at you, because I'll get your input. But, Emily's developed a template, and what I've seen so far looks good. We've used it to review in more detail the camp fees, and we made the decision that before you guys have been told there'd be like a member, non-member rate. We just collapsed it into one rate, 150, flat rate. Everybody, it looks like it'll make the program rate.
So it's a template we can apply to
Yep.
soccer,
Yep.
softball,
So
baseball,
we're
whatever.
developing, the next step is just to put a couple of other program inputs in there. That'll be kind of like the planning template, and then as the season unfolds, they'll update them with actual numbers. They'll present those to the Parks Board. The Parks Board will approve it as part of their financials, and then you guys will get to see that as part of the quarterly report. So it is in progress. We're excited about that. Park director interviews are in progress. Today I interviewed one that I would say would likely be on the short list. We've arranged a special meeting with the Parks Board for a quick 30-minute meet and greet with, hopefully we'll get 3 ultimately that they can choose from, and then a 30-minute discussion just with their input, and then we'll make the offer. So that's moving along. I expect that to wrap up next week. And let's say about the 19th, we'll have that special meeting with the Parks Board to just have them opine on who they think is a candidate that they can work with as well. With that being the case and Jason's departure, I made the decision we'll just pause the assistant director and we'll pause the special coordinator, sports coordinator, and let the new hire come in and decide, you know, do they want an assistant director? Do they find benefit maybe of having a part-time position, do something else instead? So the candidates I've talked to, they seem like they approve and appreciate that idea. With that, I think.
Well, I have a question as a park board member. We
Yes.
just went through 24 resumes.
Yes, I have them on my desk, and I have reached out to the 7 to let them know what's going on.
You had 24 resumes in how short a time for a Parks Board director?
This was for the assistant director.
For the assistant, okay.
The original plan had been we were going to trial out the assessment center approach of interviews. And then on that same day that all that was set up, Jason announced that he was resigning. So we proceeded through, and then given the concern in the community, it seems like the priority probably is getting that director filled and getting stability restored. No, none of those, they're all sitting on my desk, they're perfectly safe, and nobody said, I'm out, so we'll just keep it on pause.
Okay.
So short pause, not that pause where we all
Okay.
forget about it.
Now,
It is really, okay, we're gonna do this real quick because we have a lot of interest. As a parks director, there are a lot of people who are very qualified, who desire to have that position. So it's all part of us moving forward and making things meet the desires of the board.
Okay, because I misunderstood. I was thinking that you were just saying we're gonna hire the parks director and let them decide if they even want to do an assistant.
I think it
That's
will
what
be
I-
appropriate to have their input, yes.
But not if they want one.
If they want one, then we've got some applications, there you go.
Okay, so they may say that you don't want one and then you don't fill it.
If they don't want one, I don't think we need to.
Or if I understand it also correctly, some of the people that applied for the assistant may meet qualifications as the director. So some of those applicants
Many.
might be
Mhm.
up for the director's job.
Yeah.
Many of them.
Yep, there was some good applicants.
Okay.
Because they applied when that wasn't open. So if their resume is, you know, a really strong resume, tell me if I'm speaking out of
No.
class here, Wes.
No, you're
So if
good.
it's a strong resume, now they're eligible to take the director's job. And then as the director, decide how they want their department to look. Do they need an assistant director? Maybe they don't need an assistant director, maybe they would like 2 part-timers to,
And for a little extra context, part of that thought process came from meeting with Emily and Brenda. We found that the job descriptions are a bit muddled. There's some overlap, there's some things that they've taken on that they enjoy and they like to keep. So it seems like there's an opportunity for some restructuring and some tidying up, and I think that would be a great challenge for a director coming in, you know, giving them the open space they need to decide how they want this thing to look, how they want it to operate, who does what duty, what position titles they have. You can look at Emily and, you know, she's got youth sports coordinator and operations coordinator as her job title, which seem kind of disparate but potentially similar. Brenda shows up as front desk, but then she's got her hands in many pies, so.
Yes, she does.
I think some tidy up opportunity is there, and so you're just talking with them and looking at the concerns in the community about, you know, the leadership loss and concerns about stability. It just seems best to get that head in place quickly and get the conversations moving. It was a quick,
Yeah,
knee-jerk, gotta do something, gotta focus on something, and that just seemed to be the wiser decision.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's it, unless you all have any other questions.
for what I need to say. Sorry,
You're all right.
Omaha, X31, oh.
The thing we have to think about is that's been, part of the concern is that we've got to rethink parks to get everything on track. And this, while we can see it as a setback, can be a blossom, right? We have 2 people who promoted into other areas and left us behind, but in that, we can see growth in fixing ways and means and mechanisms to save money and be more efficient. So leaner, better machine, which is everybody's goal. And that's the goals of the citizens who've talked to, I know, have let you guys know, especially you. But it's also the imperative that's been given by this board in multiple occasions. So it's all a positive.
High-speed loader, right?
Yeah, there you go.
The fun part of the assessment center, and the guy I interviewed today said he actually really enjoyed it. His wife told him, I don't know why you're doing this, but he said, I'm glad that I did. He ended on a high. But I said, you already passed the first test by reading what I told you you were gonna do today, and you showed up. And he went through the process, and he gave some good commentary, and you know, you tell him right at the beginning, there's no wrong answer. I just wanna see how you respond, and then you get an opportunity to see the questions I ask and see if you think I'm insane or not. So it worked out well, and he enjoyed it, and as a result, he did well. So we have one strong candidate. Very strong.
But you do believe that there are many strong candidates.
Oh, of course,
So
I have
it's
to,
not like he's got a pile of
no, I
poo.
have to go through the
Oh, no,
process
It's
to
good, yeah.
speak to the others, but out of the ones I've interviewed so far, we now have one, and I would say, I would put him on the short list in a heartbeat. Yeah, my goal is to give you 3.
So it's not like when we were looking for city administrator. I don't know where that was. I know that's what's in the back of everybody's mind, like when you went through that. But
So we
remember
don't have
when
to
you,
just take whatever we get again?
remember when you guys got Mike, you were super excited, like, boom, you get
Don't pull
this
his
fresh
head up.
blood.
Next thing
So
you know, you're quoting him.
it
Look at him,
changed,
he's blushing.
it changed the way you thought that through. So don't think of this as a negative. This is a huge positive opportunity for reinvigoration.
So we're not begging someone to come to Willard like we
No.
did
No, so far,
before.
No, you've
we've-
got
we've had
great
some
people
good
who wanna expand on what Willard is.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah. And Jason, he's offered to be available if we need input. He left on good terms. Sam, our last conversation was pleasant. What I understood of Ashley's departure, she went on to better things as well. I don't know why
We
anybody would
can't
tell me
make
some
people
things.
stay.
Yeah. Their reasons may be different to what they're telling me, but if they don't tell me and they don't take advantage of an opportunity to come talk to me, I just have to say what I got. That's what I'm working with. So I think they're doing better things, we'll do better things, and all will be well.
Here yesterday, it'll be here tomorrow.
Nope. City's been here a long time.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
That's it.
All right, Dave?
I'll make a motion, we recess the open session and open the closed session pursuant to RSMO section 610.021, subsection 1 legal, and subsection 3 personnel, and subsection 13 personnel.
Second.
Have a first, have a second, all in favor, aye?
Nope.
Nope.
No,
Can't
that's
say
fine.
that, okay.
Roll call.
Sorry.
Okay.
Alder Gilliard?
Yes.
Alder Hill?
Yes.
Alder Key?
Yes.
Alder Lancaster?
Yes.
Alder Matheson?
Yes.
All
Can I
right.
propose we have a restroom break?
Yes,
Motion we adjourn the meeting. Second.
Have a first, have a second. Alder Gilliard?
All in favor?
All in favor?
Favor, aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
we do.